Let's cut the bullshit.
Just drop the jargon.
Adam and Simon's Bullshit Busters.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to this episode of Adam and Simon Bullshit Busters. My name is Simon Batchelor.
My name is Adam Bastock.
And this week we are leaning into the topic of, is the cost of net zero too expensive? So there's a lot of talk, a lot of hot air, to be frank, around the fact that the cost of implementing net zero actions now feels expensive. There is often a perception that the changes we need to make now to make reductions in our greenhouse gas emissions, both on a personal level and particularly on a business level, can feel expensive, often when compared to doing nothing. So what we wanted to do today was to sort of highlight a couple of ways in which there are some bigger considerations there that do have a real impact on your business, in order to highlight why we're still talking about net zero, even though there is this odd perception that it is expensive. So Adam, do you want to start us off by talking about a recent article that was in the FT and what sort of numbers they're bandying about?
Yeah, so I think FT's, the Financial Times, is always a very good source of a lot of the more cost-orientated impacts of climate change, and their coverage is really good. But there's an article, and they've done a couple of series on this around, one, the insurance industry and the impacts of this on sort of insurance premiums for businesses and individuals. We'll come on to that later. There's also a Guardian article which is quite helpful on that. There's one that caught our attention, though, around the City of London and how they're adapting to the changing climate. And obviously, they're quite near the river, and therefore there's quite a lot of risk with rising sea levels and heavy rainfall in terms of how they're adapting. So the good news is that they are doing some very cool things with like water gardens and designing the kind of streetscapes in a way that water can more easily run off or be moved around rather than it being surface level flooding, which I think is a really good example of how we can adapt now very quickly in making a space much more pleasant to be, but also one that is then much lower carbon, lower sort of more climate resilient as well.
Yes.
But I think the bigger numbers are around the cost of adaptation and what this actually looks like beyond just planting some nice flowers and designing some pavements. In that by 2100, so by the end of the century, it's estimated that it's going to cost around 16 billion to adapt just the City of London, bearing in mind that that is not the total greater City of London. We are talking about a couple of miles strip along the Thames here.
On one side of the river as well, that's worth bearing in mind. Not both sides, just one side.
So this is the historic core of London, so it is, a couple of miles on the north side of the river. And that's going to cost around 68 million in the next 2 years to be able to adapt to this as well. So immediately, well, one, the City of London can afford it, I imagine. There's a bigger question around where the City of London is also investing in fossil fuels, which is a whole separate episode, which we won't go into now, but I think is worth highlighting as how much are they actually driving the causes of this as well. And I think, interestingly, the Financial Times, the comment section picked up on that quite heavily. One of the better comment sections, I'd say, of all the newspapers, compared to tabloids especially.
Yes.
So I think there's a question here that's raised of, okay, well, what's the cost of inaction? The cost of them upgrading some of the gardens and some of the streetscapes to be able to cope with this is probably going to be fairly minimal compared to the damage to buildings of flooding. And I think that's what we're starting to see with the Guardian article, which is saying that home insurance claims have gone up by around 6% in the past year, just because of the amount of increase of claims from things like water flooding, like burst water pipes or flooding, and just general sort of weather-related events that are becoming more common. And personally, we saw this in the WhatsApp group for our building the other day. We got the renewal quote through for our block of flats, managed by a factor, and then it was up by about 20%, and they'd put a big kind of statement on there saying this is why, there's multiple factors working here. And people in the WhatsApp group were clearly just like, this is outrageous, why is it going up so much? And smug but poor me was therefore sitting there going, well, I think it's probably because of climate change, guys. Obviously still being impacted by the cost there, but I was like, it's likely just weather-related events across Glasgow, more flooding that's hitting these properties that's causing a general rise in this. So there's kind of multiple levels to this of the bigger state actors looking at a city and going, how ready for climate change is this region, and what is the cost of adapting that, and the cost of doing nothing. But also then at a business level or an individual level, looking at things like insurance premiums, going, well, why is that going up 5, 10, 15%? And when, more likely, is it to go up? Because I think that's the key thing here, is that it is a case of when and not if. A bit of a rant there. I'm not sure where to go from here, but over to you, Simon.
Well, essentially, I guess the situation is that at the moment, none of the metrics are going down particularly. All the metrics are actually still going up in terms of emissions. So what we're seeing here, as we've seen for the last 12 months, globally a 1.5 temperature rise. We're in month 13 of that now. So 1.5, which is the thing we're all supposed to have avoided by 2030, in 2023, we're already exceeding. So we're now we're rapidly approaching adaptation at a global and industrialized scale if we don't start to take some serious action. And I feel like we've had a couple of years of really good creative accounting, people throwing money at good bits, big brands throwing big money at renewable energy. Love that. Not a problem with that. But the reality is that these emissions are still going up.
And I think that's the real challenge here, and kind of the bite point where the insurance article has highlighted the physical risks manifesting right now on the industry. But then we're still seeing the industry, and I use that in a very broad term of sustainability and where a lot of people are at with this, in that we still have, less than 5% of businesses have actually measured their carbon footprint. And therefore, even within that, we're still seeing, of those 5%, a lot of them are treating this as an accountancy exercise, where it never has been. Climate action or net zero has always been about adaptation to your business to be more resilient to what the future is going to throw at it. And that might be commercial in terms of contract requirements. It might be in terms of retaining staff. It might be in the products that you're buying, the waste you're generating, but also, that carbon figure and the environmental impact and quantifying that. I think it's even more sort of nefarious to a certain extent. You mentioned it was offsets. It's sort of, I'm not sure what the technical word for it would be, but it is more around that trading of these renewable energy certificates of kind of guaranteed origin. That's the UK-based name for it, is REGOs, rather than the US. It's got something different. But
it's REC in the US.
Yeah, so probably renewable energy certificate, I would guess. Yeah. But, they were saying there that in the example, a data center in Nevada could buy energy that was being produced in sunlight hours in Norway and claim that as a effective certificate. And it's like, okay, there's ways that we can discuss that and whether that's morally right, wrong. But from an accountancy point of view, it makes sense on paper within a few logic jumps. But I don't really give a shit, because it is that thing of, why don't Facebook or Meta or whoever, this is just one example, it's not just them for libel reasons, anyone, is this question of, you should just be deploying your own solar capacity and doing, to a certain extent, what Google's doing, of just buying up wind turbines and increasing your generation yourselves of that energy. And I think the frustration with this is, it's very easy to get quite far away from this idea of getting so down into the details around carbon accounting and going, how do we shift these numbers away from our spreadsheet, rather than going, what would a business look like if we actually tackled these and took the biggest number and then got stuck in and went, because it doesn't really matter if the number's big or not, to a certain extent, you just want to try and then reduce it down as much as possible and really get into it and have that transformative effect within your business. And I think, just take a slight sort of detour, this is what we've seen over the past 2-3 years at Small Mighty 9 in terms of talking to small businesses and big businesses who have got a carbon footprint and have come to us and gone, we don't really understand what this means, or we're still struggling to actually make any reduction on this because it's just a number. It doesn't really mean anything to us. It's not got that sort of context of going, is this a big number or a small number? Is this good or bad? What does it mean for us in terms of the business? And I think that's where we need to be operating much more in, is the transformation of going, this number means that you're probably exposed to certain risks, such as if you're using a lot of energy, that's a high carbon footprint, also means a lot of money is going out on energy. There's probably ways you can reduce that down much more effectively by deploying your own solar, rather than pissing around with buying renewable energy certificates from certain places to try and shift just that number, make that number go down. There's cost implications of that. But I think this is where it links back again into the insurance piece of going, if you've got solar panels and a site that has been designed with climate adaptation and climate risk within mind, you're probably going to have much lower insurance premiums because they can analyse that site and realise that if there is a flood, maybe you've designed the building so that water is going to flow through it rather than ruin all the stock because of however you've designed it. And that's what we're starting to get to, I think, is as that insurance industry wakes up, it's probably going to be a little bit, it's going to be the unexpected canary in the climate mine of what this actually looks like and what the costs really look like.
Yeah, I think so, because once insurance sees a risk, they will charge you for it. And climate is a risk. You know, there's a number of very high-profile insurers who are saying that's currently their biggest risk is climate change. It's not fire, it's not cybersecurity, it's not people breaking in. It's the fact that the size of business operation they're insuring is either isn't viable and therefore is uninsurable, or in the long term is going to be subject to water scarcity or flooding or fires, as you've said. And I think just to bring it back to what we opened with about the cost of this net zero transition, you know, the inconvenient truth is that according to an article in the FT, all the way back in the heady days of July 2021, basically that the Office of Budget Responsibility in the UK, so that's the government department that checks the sums of the government to make sure that their hot air adds up, said that actually the funding the transition to net zero would cost less than the pandemic. So
Wow.
there's an interesting amount there. So we're looking at what the government claimed that was around, 240 billion. And they found that money under a mattress in 3 weeks. You know, that money was there. They shook the magic money tree and everybody got paid. It was literally, they gave money away for 2 years with no strings attached because they could. And all of a sudden, the money was there. And now we're looking at an existential crisis and they can't find a couple of billion quid to rub together. It's like the money is there, the cost is coming, and the cost is coming, but the cost is, as we've seen, tens, hundreds, thousands of times more expensive. So this isn't meant as a scaremongering exercise or a doom and gloom, but it's just about thinking realistically about your business. If you are building a long-term business, if you're building a legacy, you're building something you want to be proud of, pass on to, you know, the next generation in your family, for example. I know a lot of business owners think about that. Or there's a business that you want to build up and sell. Being able to prove that your business is climate resilient or your business is just resilient. Let's just go straight up resilient. You know, do you have a good business model that lasts and is transferable to someone else? Just taking a step back and looking at your business from that perspective, I think is a really worthwhile exercise, and something that I think if we all did as business owners, those little changes we can make, they, you know, yes, it puts a bit of pressure. It might shave a percentage, 2%, 3% off your margin for a few years, but it might mean you're still around in 5 to 10 years to make money in 5-10 years. So it's that sort of short-term pain for long-term gain, I think, is something that actually is a trade-off people might not be aware of. And that's kind of what we wanted to highlight here, is that, you know, the people whose job it is to think long-term, the insurance companies, the City of London, you know, there's a reason they're still the world's wealthiest. What's the word for the little country within a country? It's not enclave. It's like something like that.
I was trying to think of it earlier, but I couldn't remember what it was.
They've been around since Magna Carta. Yeah, if you know, let us know. They've got a name. They're still like the country within a country in England. You know, how they're still going is because they've got long-term thinking. They're not about short-term gain. They're about long-term thinking. And if they've suddenly shaken their magic money tree and found 16 billion quid between them to build a wall, it feels like that's a bit of a wake-up call, I think, for everybody else to be like...
I think in terms of like, what do you do about it as well is, well, in terms of shaving that 2 or 3% off, as you say, taking that short-term hit, already we're seeing that insurance premiums have gone up 6% in the past year. So this might get kind of spicy quite quickly. And therefore, the more that you can prepare yourself and go, well, actually, what is our climate adaptation plan? What is our climate resilience plan? What is our carbon reduction plan? Those don't need to be particularly well I say well thought out documents, but they need to be well thought out, but they don't need to be comprehensive, sort of 45-page PDFs that are branded up and perfectly formed. It is just, do you have an awareness over what happens if there is a month's worth of rain in overnight? Does your factory get flooded? Have you done an analysis on that? There's typically funding available from local councils to start looking at that, depending on where you are. But I think having those mitigation policies in place, like you would do for health and safety, or if there's a fire, is going to be really important to make sure that you're just thinking about that. And if you're then doing any development work to the site, well, actually, do you put tarmac over the entire car park, or do you have sort of runoff routes for water that means that you're not quite as impacted? And that probably isn't going to cost that much more money. It's just being aware of it and thinking about it and making sure that the decisions you're making of suppliers you're going with, or how staff can get to work, and the locations you choose for offices is all going to integrate and impact into that.
Yeah, exactly. So if you are working in this area, or you have an example of something you've done recently where you have thought about this and you've made the decision in your business, then do let us know. Send me or Adam a message. We'd love to hear more about it. We're always keen to talk to anybody who has any ideas. If you similarly, on the flip side of that, have a business and you've suddenly, after listening to this episode, thought, hang on a minute, I feel like I might be really exposed here, then also get in touch. We'd love to talk to you about that, and maybe we can help come up with some ideas, and maybe we can kind of brainstorm some of that. On the podcast, we can kind of work through some of those ideas. So yeah, we're always happy to hear from people who are working in the space, who are interested or curious about anything we've spoken about. Do reach out to us on LinkedIn and find us there. And if there is someone running a business who you think might find this episode useful, then do send them a link. You can find us on YouTube as well as the podcast, depending on where you're listening or watching this. We are available on all the different platforms, so do search for us there. And until next time, have fun. We'll see you then. Bye.
Bye.
Let's cut the bullshit.
Just drop the job.
Adam and Simon's bullshit.